Notre Dame was in the midst of one of the best offseason stretches in recent memory up until news broke that Charles Jagusah broke his arm and will miss the start of this season. Now the Irish face real adversity for the first time in months. So what should fans expect when the Irish take the field against Miami? Tim Murray and I break it all down next.
You are Locked On Irish, your daily podcast on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, and welcome into another edition of Locked On Irish, your daily Notre Dame podcast. I'm Tyler Wojciak, and I'm the host. I'm a Notre Dame alum, producer at Fox Sports, and I've been covering the Irish since 2020. Today is Wednesday, July 9th, and thank you for getting your day started right here by making this your first watch or listen of the day. If you have not already, please take a second to subscribe to the show on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. And don't forget, I'm going to be back here this Friday with another Friday mailbag. So drop your questions in the YouTube comments, on X at Locked On Irish, or on Instagram at Locked On Irish Pod. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. All right, today's episode is going to be a lot of fun. Friend of the program, Tim Murray from VSiN, makes his return to the show to talk all things Notre Dame with some betting insight mixed in as well. We're going to get Tim's reaction to Charles Jagusah's injury and whether he may or may not have jinxed the Irish. Then we're going to dig into the betting lines for Notre Dame's biggest matchups, Miami, Texas A&M, and USC, and what that says about how Vegas perceives Notre Dame's ceiling. Plus, we'll talk quarterback confidence, USC drama, and how Notre Dame's recruiting momentum is shifting national perception. Let's dive in. All right, Tim, you and I were texting last week about how everything's been going almost too well for Notre Dame. It had been nothing but sunshine and rainbow for weeks. And admittedly, you and I aren't used to that because we can be a little pessimistic at times. And I'm looking at a text from you that says, what's going to be the first negative thing to happen? It can't always be great news. And then not even a week later, Charles Jagusah crashes a UTV and breaks his arm. So I need to know, how much responsibility are you willing to accept for this very unfortunate development?
Yeah, man. It was a little foreshadowing because you'd be texting me, "Hey, we got this guy in recruiting. We got this guy in recruiting." I'm like, "What? How is this? How is this happening? How is Notre Dame hitting 100% on the recruiting trail with these 4 and sometimes 5-star recruits?" And then you get the news over the weekend, they sweep the board on all the wide receivers. So, it's just, I don't want to say it's because it's Notre Dame, because plenty of other teams have bad luck, but you knew something was going to happen. Is this on the level of, Everett Golson deciding he's going to transfer out of the program, 10, 12 years ago?
Or get suspended?
Is this the Frozen 4 or whatever, the Frozen 5, whatever it was? No. But, this is certainly something that hurts. And, for Charles Jagusah, I was listening to, am I allowed to say, a rival podcast yesterday?
They're our friends.
Yeah. And John Bryce had great information, as he always does, from Football Scoop. And, I think, and I'm curious, Tyler, your thoughts, and I'm sure Notre Dame fans are kind of mixed because on one end, we were all in college, and it sounds like from the details that John Bryce was unable to unearth, it doesn't really sound like this was a reckless ATV, I'm being an idiot type of thing. It sounds like there were a lot of, folks involved from law enforcement. It was actually, I don't want to say reassuring, but it was interesting to hear the story and how he had heard it, with everything involved out in Wyoming. So, I heard another podcast talk about, there's a big ATV race in South Bend. I'm like, it didn't happen in South Bend. It happened in Cody, Wyoming. So, some people didn't get all the details right, and we're still going to find out more as it comes about. But look, from a football side of things, it stinks. It does raise the question of, NIL money and, is this going to lead to clauses and contracts and all of that? Because essentially we're getting to the point of them being professionals, Tyler. But, just for Charles Jagusah, it sucks. For Notre Dame, it sucks. For fans, it sucks. But you feel for this young man who, battled back from that pec injury a year ago. It's funny. I was thinking back to last August. I had a podcast, Tyler, where we spent the whole time talking about, what does this do for Notre Dame? They lose their starting left tackle. What are they going to do at left tackle? Certainly right now, it being early July, camp hasn't started. They're in much better shape, you would think, to replace Charles Jagusah at guard as opposed to last year at the start of camp to replace him at left tackle. And ultimately, Anthony Knapp did just fine for 15 games before he got hurt prior to the national championship game. So, you feel for him. It's an unfortunate situation, and once again, I think the John Bryce news, I don't know about you, Tyler, it made me feel a little bit better because initially I was thinking, man, this is so reckless. This is so irresponsible. Then you start to go a little bit down a rabbit hole like, man, this team, lost 5 captains. So is there no leadership? Why are they doing silly things? And then you hear some of the details come out about it and you're like, all right, it just sounds like it was kind of a freak accident that was unfortunate for Charles Jagusah to be on that side of it.
Look, I'm not going to lie. When I first started hearing that Charles Jagusah broke his arm, at the time it was an ATV accident. Now it's a UTV, which is a little bit different. I think UTVs are a little bit safer. Maybe I'm completely wrong and someone will call me out in the comments. But I went from thinking, wow, what a stupid move, to actually feeling almost defensive for Charles Jagusah based on some of the reaction that I had seen from fans. And I understand it. Like I talked about this in yesterday's show, when you have a really talented player who hurts himself doing something off the field and you hear UTV, you're thinking, yeah, it was a reckless decision. But also, it seemed like a pretty controlled environment. There was law enforcement there. There were 10 other teammates. Luke Talich's family, they're all around. They're from Wyoming. I'm sure they've driven these things a million times and maybe never got hurt. I just think that it's unfortunate what happened. And if there is a clause in his NIL deal where he loses out some money, I'm in favor of that. But I also don't want to punish the kid to the point where we're just going to cut all of his money because he's probably counting on that at this point. And I do feel some grace for him because, like you said, we all were in college. We all probably made some decisions that were a little bit reckless and maybe we got away with it. And unfortunately, in this case, it didn't happen for Charles Jagusah. But as it pertains to Notre Dame and the offensive line, they do have some time to adjust and figure out life without Charles Jagusah. But the toughest stretch of the schedule hits right away. They open as 3.5-point favorites on the road at Miami, but it feels like there's extremely intense pressure on Mario Cristobal to finally deliver a signature win. So how are you feeling about that matchup now that Charles Jagusah is out and we're less than 2 months from kickoff?
Yeah. I don't think it changes my feeling on the game as a whole. Look, I was nervous about the game even with the healthy Charles Jagusah. I think this is, as you alluded to, this is an enormous game for Miami. Think about how their season ended a year ago. You could count the bowl game, whatever. I'm not going to count that. Regular season finale, they lose to Syracuse. Mario Cristobal makes a poor decision, kicks a field goal down 7 instead of giving the ball to Cam Ward on 4th down, and they never get the ball back. You go on the road and you lose that game that if you win, you're going to the college football playoffs. So to your point, this has been a program in Miami that has spent an exorbitant amount of resources on building up this roster. The fascinating thing about Miami, and we could get more into nuts and bolts of this game a little bit further down the road, is this is a team that lost a ton in the secondary. So with Notre Dame's bolstered receiving core, how is that going to look? It's expected to be, and I still think it will be, a battle up front. I think Miami's offensive line is one of the best in the country. Notre Dame's, even without Charles Jagusah, still one of the best offensive lines in the country. You've got a elite running back room, as we know, with Notre Dame. So, look, I am generally pessimistic at heart, and as a gambler, when I look at a point spread being initially 2.5, which made me worried, and why the number wasn't really moving, that made me worrisome. Now we're sitting at 3.5. So a little bit of money has come in on the Irish to bump that up. But I'll tell you this right now. I still think Notre Dame will probably be one of the most public-sided sides of the opening weekend. So that always makes me nervous just as a bettor when I look at the public side loading up on one particular team on a relatively short line. So, look, I have talked about it a bunch this offseason on my podcast, Tyler, that I think Carson Beck, if he is healthy, and remember, he's coming back from Tommy John surgery, which is kind of unprecedented for a quarterback. But if he's healthy, you look at some of the numbers that he had at Georgia, and I think he's kind of getting overlooked. I thought David Hale did a really good job earlier this offseason in an article on ESPN.com doing some blind resumes and comparing his numbers to a Garrett Nussmeier, who everybody seems to be, in line with him being the number one overall pick. And I think there are a couple quarterbacks in the country this year, Tyler, that I think you can maybe buy low a little bit on. And I think Carson Beck may be one of those quarterbacks. So we'll see. It's got to be hot as hell down there in Miami. As we all know, the last time the Irish played against Miami in Miami, it was an absolute hornet's nest and, brutal game for Notre Dame. There's a couple of what ifs that happened in that opening quarter. But yeah, I think the Charles Jagusah injury, I wouldn't say changes my opinion on the game. I think it was a worrisome game regardless. And I think realistically, this is going to be the most challenging test for the Irish the entire regular season, and with or without Charles Jagusah.
Tim is going to be right back here with us in a second to break down who we think will replace Charles Jagusah on the offensive line. Plus, we're going to look ahead to some of the biggest matchups this season. But before we do, I want to tell you about a great new promotion from our friends at FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. I've been using FanDuel to track my favorite matchups, and the app keeps it fresh with new daily promotions and fun ways to bet. It's easy to use, fast to pay out, and makes even regular season games feel like must-watch events. Whether I'm placing a same-game parlay or watching a bet ride into the ninth inning, FanDuel makes it feel like I'm part of the action. If you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Who do you think is going to be the starting five of the offensive line for that game?
I think I'm going to go pretty chalky here. I'll go Anthony Knapp, left tackle, Billy Schrauth, Ashton Craig, Sullivan Absher, and Emil Wagner. I know, and you could speak to this more so than I can, I think, Tyler, but I know there's probably some push and excitement about Will Black, this, hunky 4-5-star dude. Maybe you put him at a tackle, but it does feel like Joe Rudolph, correct me if I'm wrong, even with Jagusah expected to be healthy, wanted to keep Knapp at left tackle. So even though Charles Jagusah was sitting there at guard, as maybe the best tackle on the team, I know he's an exceptional guard. My projection would be that Absher just steps in and takes over at guard. What do you think?
I'm with you. I think the exact same setup there with Knapp at left tackle, Schrauth at left guard, Craig, and then Sullivan Absher coming in to replace Charles Jagusah, and then Emil Wagner. I agree with your point. I think Joe Rudolph really does like Anthony Knapp at left tackle, and I know that there's a ton of excitement about Will Black, and we've seen some true freshmen start on the offensive line in recent years, but Will Black was not an early enrollee, and I think that really matters because Anthony Knapp he got a leg up on Gerby Lambert, and then Anthony Knapp ends up being the true freshman who starts 15 games, and Gerby Lambert is more of a reserve player, even though I think most people would agree, even after what Anthony Knapp did in his freshman season, that Gerby Lambert probably has a higher ceiling, but we'll see how things play out. It's obviously going to be one of the biggest talking points outside of quarterback, which leads me to my next question. Notre Dame plays Texas A&M after Miami. That is one hell of a 1-2 punch to start off the season. And Notre Dame, at this point, is a 7.5-point favorite over the Aggies on FanDuel. That number kind of caught me off guard. I felt like Notre Dame should be favored, but A&M should have a strong defense, and we still don't know what Notre Dame has at quarterback, whether it be CJ Carr or Kenny Minchie. We know that they're talented, but it's a whole different ballgame when you're going out there on a Saturday night in South Bend against a team like A&M led by Mike Elko. So do you think that spread reflects real confidence in CJ Carr or the quarterback situation at Notre Dame, or do you think it's more about a belief in Marcus Freeman and the roster around the quarterback?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I think it's this Notre Dame program that has continued to build up. And let's just take a step back. And I just tweeted this out earlier today, Tyler, which is Notre Dame in year one under Marcus Freeman, if you include the bowl loss to Oklahoma State, was 7-7 against the spread. Since then, they have been by far and away the best cover team in college football, 21-6-2 against the spread. That is stupid. Like that doesn't make sense. Top four last 2 years, when you put it together, it blows everyone out of the water, covering by over 8.5 points per game. So I think there is a realization that this roster is not, and this isn't a dig at Brian Kelly, because we could get in a whole discussion about Brian Kelly and all of that. And I know he's a cursed name in South Bend, but I don't think Notre Dame is here without Brian Kelly. But I think Marcus Freeman was the perfect coach to take over the program when Kelly left, to kind of push them up. And it's, a buy-in from the administration, all of that. But I do think it is starting to be a recognition of where this roster is at and how they have been recruiting at an elite level over the past couple of years, and the fact that they've been exceeding odds makers' expectations. So, when you look at the futures market, there was a sports book here in town that had a 30-1 on Notre Dame. I thought that was way off mark. And now you're seeing most of the sports books in that 12 to 14-1 range for Notre Dame, which is settling in around 5th or 6th best odds in the country. And I think that's about right. And then you bring it to the Texas A&M game, Tyler, where could the number be a bit off? Maybe, but let's realize this is a night game at Notre Dame Stadium. If you give up Notre Dame maybe 3.5 points for home field, is Notre Dame 4 points better than Texas A&M, or 3.5 points better than Texas A&M on a neutral? I think that's about fair, because last year they went down to College Station. They won the game. Granted, the score may be a little bit misleading. Then we all know how that game played out. It was a true coin toss game. Notre Dame gets a late touchdown and then the field goal to lock it up to make it 23-13. But Notre Dame was a slight underdog a year ago. I think Notre Dame has proven that they are a better program than they were at the start of last season. So I think when you take a step back and say, wow, 7 is a lot, it is, but it also makes some sense where if Notre Dame was at College Station, this game would maybe be a pick, Notre Dame -1, which I think is probably accurate of where these two programs are. Not to say that, that night game at Notre Dame Stadium is going to be an easy one by any stretch of the imagination, but I think Notre Dame being a 7-point favorite is about right of where these two programs are currently.
Speaking of big numbers, let's talk about USC. Notre Dame is currently a 10.5 point favorite in that game, which says a lot. But it feels like this rivalry has gotten a little more personal as of late, after I think we could call them relatively boring, mundane years in the rivalry. It feels like Notre Dame has been dominating for a long time. And even though USC got that win in 2022, Notre Dame wasn't in a really good place. These two teams have not been competing at the same level for a long time. It's been going back and forth. But now you've got Chad Bowden leaving South Bend to join the Trojans. USC's social media team has been throwing some not so subtle jabs. And of course, the whole maybe we won't renew the rivalry move from the USC side, that's really only added fuel to the fire. But when you strip away all the noise, do you feel like the Irish are that much better than USC on the field? Does that double-digit spread feel justified to you right now?
Yeah, it does. I mean, Notre Dame last year, if I remember correctly, was a 7-point favorite at USC. So that would be telling us that on a neutral, Notre Dame would be around a 10-point favorite a year ago, and they're a 10.5 point favorite. Now, there is another sports book that is at 12.5, but I think that's kind of accurate of where we're at. So look, I think USC is going to be an improved team this year. I am not the biggest Jaden Mayava fan. I think they've got some big-time wide receivers, and we saw that last year. Look, I was in attendance. You were in attendance at that game. 49-35 was not really indicative of that game. It was, a tie ball game, and USC is driving to try to take the lead on Notre Dame in the fourth quarter, and then they get the pick six. They get another pick six, and it plays out the way that it does. Now, I think from a scheduling standpoint, USC playing Michigan the week prior, I think is not ideal for the Trojans. As we've seen under Lincoln Riley, this is not a team that is generally built to be a physical team and to play a very physical team in Michigan prior to traveling to the Midwest, where traveling a year ago was a horror show for this USC team. So I do think this USC team will be improved. I know it's a massive season for Lincoln Riley. As you can see, they're crushing it right now on the recruiting trail. But knowing Marcus Freeman and knowing how much he gets his team up for games and knowing this is a night game at Notre Dame Stadium, I think this is a team that's going to be absolutely geared up for this game, and I know this is a question a little bit later on in the show, which makes me absolutely terrified about the week prior against NC State. I think that is a brutal situational spot for the Irish to be welcoming in a well-coached team by Dave Doran. They've had success against this NC State team. Remember a couple of years ago when, not the Hurricane game where they, ate hot dogs in the locker room and Audric Estime broke a big run, but the game where I think NC State, if I remember correctly, Tyler, was it 2016, 17?
2017 was when they were ranked.
Yeah. And that was a game that people thought Notre Dame could be in trouble here, and Notre Dame smacked them, absolutely worked them. 2016 was the Hurricane game, which was an absolute disaster with the snaps and whatnot. So, I think there's some tricky landmines on the schedule, but there's no doubt, especially with everything that Bowden and USC folks have been kind of needling Notre Dame. Marcus Freeman flat out saying, we want this rivalry to continue. We'll play it anytime you want. I think there's going to be vibes of 2014 Michigan a little bit in Notre Dame Stadium on that October evening.
It's going to be very intense. I'm going to that game. I cannot wait. And for all the public stuff that's been going on between the two schools, where they have this basically PR war at this point, talking about the rivalry, but then in terms of the jabs from Bowden and all that stuff, that's been all USC. But I know just from watching Marcus Freeman these past 3 and 4 years since he started at Notre Dame, he takes stuff personal. It's like the James Franklin thing all over again. I'm sure he's been taking note of every single jab that USC has thrown ever since Chad left the program. So I have zero doubt that Notre Dame is going to be up for that game. But the issue in the Marcus Freeman era has not been the big games. It's been the small games, the trip-up games where they just lay an absolute dud. There's obviously the Northern Illinois, the Marshall, the Stanford back in 2022, but there's also been the Louisville game a couple years ago where they obviously are a much better program than the teams I just mentioned, but they just were so flat in that game. The Clemson game, a few games later in that same season in 2023, was really uninspiring as well. So you've already talked about NC State. Is there one game on the schedule that you would consider the biggest prove-it game for Marcus Freeman, that era, that issue for this program is behind him?
Yeah, I think the easy one, and I know a lot of Notre Dame fans are worried about it, would be Arkansas. I think they're going to be up for Arkansas. You're going to an SEC stadium. I think it works out to Notre Dame's advantage. That's going to be an 11 a.m. local kick, on a very busy day. That's the day of Penn State, Oregon. That's the day of Georgia, Alabama. So I wasn't surprised to see it be an early kick on ABC. I think the two games for me, the prove-it games, I think I'll say three. I'll say NC State terrifies me because it's the Peacock game. Historically speaking, Notre Dame has played terrible on this Peacock-only game, whether it was almost losing to Toledo, whether it was struggling in an ugly win against UNLV before UNLV kind of became good, right? They won 44-21. They didn't cover. It was kind of a clunky game in Marcus Freeman's first year. So the Peacock game has kind of been not so great. So I think the NC State game worries me. Boston College, a little bit off a bye. It's kind of a weird spot. You're going on the road. I mean, history would tell you that playing at Chestnut Hill is not always been the best for the Irish, even though I think the last time they played in Chestnut Hill, I want to say they ran for 300-something yards.
Yeah, they did.
Absolutely clobbered them. What was that, 2015?
I think it was with Brandon Wimbush. He ran for 1 million yards.
Yeah, so that game, a little bit worrisome. But the game that I have circled as a weird spot is Pittsburgh. Look, I hate Pat Narduzzi. I think he's a dope. He's always had pointed comments at Notre Dame. He's been, tried to be, this big bad guy and tried to single cover Will Fuller, and Will Fuller went for 3 touchdowns. But look, Pittsburgh historically, Tyler, has been a team that has just kind of been a thorn in the side of Notre Dame, whether it was Stephon Tuitt getting ejected from that game and an absolutely ridiculous targeting call that still pisses me off to this day. Or look, let's remember Notre Dame was very fortunate from a whistle against Pitt in the undefeated 2012 season that I know Pitt fans are still upset about. Whether it was the game that I attended in, God, what was it, 11, the 15-12 game at Heinz Field. Like this rivalry is a weird one. The game they played, I want to say in the COVID season, it was 19-14. It was finals week. So there's always been weird games. So I think Pitt on November 15th, after you play Navy, which will be a night game prior to playing Syracuse on senior day, I think if I had to pinpoint one game in a pecking order, it would be Pitt 1, NC State 2, Boston College 3. And I'll say this, the two G5 teams this year that Notre Dame play, I think they're going to be ready for both of them, because it's Boise State, who went to the college football playoff a year ago, probably will be undefeated heading into that game. And then if you look at Navy's schedule, Navy's probably not probably, but has a good chance to be undefeated. I think they'll be favored in every game. So I think the two G5 teams that Notre Dame plays this year, they'll actually be up for both of those opponents. I think it's teams like NC State and Pitt where they could potentially overlook them a little bit.
I'm actually not worried about NC State or Pitt at all. I think NC State has just been on the decline. I know what they used to be, but it feels like they are just so far away from that, and they lost like Concepcion over the offseason. And I honestly feel like Notre Dame broke Pitt a couple of years ago. I mean, the 2020 game, Notre Dame smoked them. They won like 45-3, because I remember after that game, Brian Kelly was like, yeah, we've actually been focused on Clemson. And he never said anything like that. So you're like, wow, this team is serious this year. And a couple years ago when Notre Dame just smoked them in Notre Dame Stadium. So I'm not worried about them. And same with NC State. But I'm with you on Boston College. I think last year they were just really a difficult team to play. I think Bill O'Brien's got some momentum there. Not to say that Notre Dame is going to lose that game, but I just think that's going to be a little bit trickier. But I am very concerned about that Boise State game, just kind of where it falls in the schedule after Arkansas and then a couple weeks before that USC game. I think they have a good offensive line. Like, they have what it takes to stay in the game, and you know that they're going to come ready to play. So that is one game, or two games, I should say, that really, not like I'm super concerned. I'm not losing sleep at night, but they are definitely ones that I have my eye on.
Yeah, I was just looking back a little bit at the Pitt history. I had my dates a little bit messed up. So yeah, the 2020 game was the domination. The 2023 game was the one where Phil Jerkovic tried to, he put out that comments on Instagram or something that. So
he put it out when he was at Boston College, and then Notre Dame, that was in the snow game, and they destroyed him. But then he was at Pitt, and you thought, oh my God, we're going to actually get it. Pat Narduzzi in Notre Dame Stadium, and then Phil Jerkovic didn't hold up his end of the bargain. He ended up being moved to tight end midseason.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, Notre Dame should take care of business in all of these games. Look, Notre Dame's going to be a favorite in every single game, barring catastrophic injury. But I think this year's schedule, if we had done this conversation a year ago, we would have never thought that Northern Illinois would be the lone trip up spot on the schedule. But I think this year, while I would say that there is no at Texas A&M, even though at Miami is certainly tricky and will be a geared up environment, and I'm looking forward to heading down to that game, I think there are more curious spots. I talked to Colin Wilson from the Action Network, who loves Arkansas, went to Arkansas, knows that program inside and out, Tyler. He said they've been talking about that Notre Dame game for years. Like, that is the game that they're eyeing up there, are Arkansas fans. But they're kind of in a weird situation too as a program with, Sam Pittman and Bobby Petrino there. And, is Sam Pittman going to be, long for the season? Look, Colin, I don't know if he's just being a pessimistic fan, but he thinks Notre Dame's going to absolutely destroy him. So, yeah, I mean, that's a weird spot, down there in Fayetteville. But I think Notre Dame should be ready for Boise State. I'll learn more about Boise State coming up shortly when Mountain West Media Days comes to Vegas. But I think that's going to be a fascinating game. I think this is a Boise State team that lost a lot, obviously Ashton Genty, but they do bring back a decent amount. If you look at Bill Conley and some of his returning production points, he notes that I think Boise State brings back the most production of any team in the Mountain West. So this is a team that's favored to win, to earn the G5 bid, and I think rightfully so. I think they are clear-cut the best G5 team out there. So, October 4th, I think there'll be plenty of blue in the stadium. There's no doubt. That is a fan base that travels. I mean, look, the Fiesta Bowl, man, that wasn't Penn State blue. That was Boise State blue down there in Glendale, Arizona. Now, it didn't work out for them, obviously. And I think Notre Dame, at the end of the day, right, they're just better as a program than every team on their schedule. So they should take care of business this year.
I want to bring it back to how we started this, because it's unfortunate how the Charles Jagusah injury, obviously it's very impactful for this upcoming season, but it overshadowed what was a pretty incredible weekend for Notre Dame on the recruiting trail, and they've just been rolling for weeks now. So as a fan, how are you feeling about the direction of the program right now?
Oh man, I'm on cloud nine. I mean, this is what we've been asking for, is for Notre Dame to take the next step in recruiting. And now I recognize that Notre Dame is probably going to finish what, Tyler? I don't know, 7th or 8th maybe in recruiting. But I think when you look at some of the guys that they've brought in, whether it was, Ian Premer, who we thought there was no chance that Notre Dame would get him. Everything was he wants to stay in Kansas. He, all of that. And then I think you texted me like, they got Ian Premer. I'm like, wait, what? How did this happen? To go into Pennsylvania and to pull out Joey O'Brien, I thought was just a massive coup for this coaching staff. And it's been funny because I don't know. I think it might have been Pete Sampson on with Irish Illustrated in recent years, where you're like, which one would you want? And their answer has always been, why not both? And it feels like this year's recruiting class, Tyler, is, well, why not both? Why not all three wide receivers? And I'm not saying that these wide receivers are, Michael Floyd and, whoever, but to go into Texas, to take away a guy that is a Texas legacy in Kadon Finley, that is a prize recruit, is pretty wild and pretty telling about this program. And I think, one thing that I think, and I don't have the inside information like you do and others do, but I think what I'm gathering is obviously Marcus Freeman and this staff is clearly knowing how to hit the right buttons with recruits. That's important. But I also think there clearly is a component. There's a buy-in from the administration, from the NIL. They've got everything in order. It just feels like it's a fine-tuned machine. And every time, at least recently, you see this prospect with Notre Dame involved is making his selection, they've been hitting like 95%, it feels like. So it's pretty wild to see those official visits that took place in early June and how much they just absolutely crushed it and nailed it out of the park. So look, I think ultimately this might be one of the best recruiting classes in school history. And I'll say this too, when you think about the ability of Mike Mickens and this staff to cultivate this talent, whether it be, look, Leonard Moore was not a 5-star recruit. He's now going to be a first-round pick. Benjamin Morrison was not a 5-star recruit. He was a second-round pick. If he doesn't get hurt, maybe he's a first-round pick, Tyler. So not only is there Notre Dame is right now recruiting at an elite level, we know once they get into the building that Notre Dame's going to be able to cultivate this talent as well, which I think is just the perfect duality of what feels like is going on with this recruiting process.
This is the level that we expected Notre Dame to be recruiting at when Marcus Freeman took over as head coach before the 2022 season. But as we learned over time, as much as the head coach wants to exert himself on the recruiting trail and as much effort as he puts in, there's a lot of other factors that are extremely important in order for Notre Dame to land the big fish that they're going after. Number one, results on the field. You have to win. And even though Notre Dame had been winning, they had not been winning at this level where you're beating a Georgia, you're beating a Penn State in the college football playoff semifinals. So that's a part of it. Like you mentioned, the buy-in from the administration is huge. I think for a long time, they were not necessarily at odds with one another, but they weren't rowing in the same direction all the time. And I think that led to some issues. But now the way that Marcus Freeman has the program and the way that Pete Bavacqua has the athletic department, they are so perfectly in sync. And I think you're seeing the results of that, one on the field in the college football playoff, but also on the recruiting trail. But you host a national show. You have a national college football podcast. And obviously you're very plugged into Notre Dame. Do you get the sense that this recent stretch of commitments is starting to change the national perception of Notre Dame? Because the playoff run obviously put people on notice, but now that they're recruiting with the big dogs, after that success, it feels like what they're building is much more sustainable.
I'll be honest. I don't think it's the recruiting, and I think that's more in the weeds with us. And not to say that your Bud Elliott's, et cetera, out there don't follow recruiting, but I go back to the run to the national championship, and I think whether it's fair or not, I think there are two teams out there that have always kind of felt like they're on the same playing field, Notre Dame and Penn State, and they both have had issues of, can they win the big one? Well, Notre Dame now could put that to bed because they beat the SEC champion in Georgia and they beat Penn State. Penn State, whether it's right or wrong, they got dealt the hand of, we beat SMU and we beat Boise State. And there was always this worry, I felt like, Tyler, from Notre Dame fans is like, well, what if we beat, no offense to Indiana, because I've already pissed off Indiana fans plenty in this offseason, but what if we just beat Indiana and they lost to Georgia? Which, I'll be honest, full disclosure, I thought they were going to lose to Georgia because Notre Dame always loses to Georgia. They always lose to the big boy in the biggest stage. I think the perception is changing because of the two wins that they had. And, 34-23 was the final score against Ohio State, but it's 31-23. And if they don't play single coverage against maybe a generational talent at wide receiver, maybe we're talking about a little something different and a possibility of forcing overtime. But I think those two performances have really changed the perception of this Notre Dame football team in the eyes of many, because I think until they finally had success in the postseason, and whether or not, look, your audience is Notre Dame fans, so they understand this, but people don't care that in 2018, when they got absolutely curb stomped by Clemson, that Clemson ended up beating Alabama by more points in the national championship. They don't care that when Notre Dame lost to Alabama in 2020, that Alabama went on and won the national championship by more points. They don't care about that. It's, Notre Dame, here they are again. They lost again. But now they can shut those people up because they beat Georgia and they beat Penn State in big moments. They stepped up, they made the big plays, and they're also putting guys into the league. Seeing someone like Kyle Hamilton become an elite superstar in the National Football League, I think is big, because Notre Dame's always had, your Quentin Nelsons. They've always had these big time offensive linemen, but the question is always continued to be, does Notre Dame have those skill position players? Well, right now they've got the best running back in the nation and Jeremiah Love. And not only is he the best running back in the country, he does it in highlight fashion. He outruns people. He hurdles people. So I think Notre Dame has got a lot of this mojo rolling. And let's be honest, man, they've got a cool head coach. Like it's not, it's not Charlie Weiss. It's not Brian Kelly. They've got Marcus Freeman. They've got a dude that played in the NFL, that played at Ohio State, that was in the, NCAA college football game. So there's a lot rolling for them, but they've got to continue. And I think that's the biggest thing for the Irish. So yes, the recruiting is great, but I think more so the perception from a national standpoint on the Irish is based off of what they did last year when they beat Georgia, when they beat Penn State, and when they were competitive against Ohio State. And, now we'll see if they can duplicate or replicate those results.
Tim, this has been great. Please feel free to plug everything you've got going on, because I know you're ramping up for the start of the season as well.
Yeah, the VSiN College Football Betting Podcast. I'll be doing a deep dive on Notre Dame later this week. I'll be having Phil Steele on this week, so check it out wherever you get your podcasts. I know there's a million podcasts out there, but check us out. Exclusively talking college football, and once the season gets rolling, we'll do 3 episodes a week, so make sure to check that out wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, man. Thanks again for doing this. This has been a lot of fun, as always, and it's getting close. I can feel it, man.
Getting close, baby. Can't wait. See you, Tyler.
That's a wrap for this episode. Thanks again for making Locked On Irish your first watch or listen of the day. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform and leave a like, rating, or review. It really helps the show grow. And don't forget, I'll be back on Friday with another Friday mailbag. So make sure to get your questions in on YouTube, on X at Locked On Irish, or Instagram at Locked On Irish Pod. I'll see you then.